that is strong and sustainable, not just on an election day, but in the day-to-day lives of the people of the Americas. And that's what counts. That is what is so badly needed. That is what's so badly needed, not just in Cuba, not just in Venezuela, but in our Southwest, in Haiti as well. The Haitian people have suffered too long. The Haitian people have suffered too long under governments that care more about their own power than their people's progress and prosperity. It's time to press Haiti's leaders to bridge the divides between them. And it's time to invest in the economic development that must underpin security that the Haitian people lack. And that is why the second part of my agenda will be advancing freedom from fear in the Americas. For too many people in our hemisphere, security is absent from their daily lives. The amazing people who were introduced earlier, and I would love to meet after our speech, they know what it's like to deal with an oppressive regime and to live in fear. And for far too long, Washington's been trapped in a conventional thinking about Latin America and the Caribbean. From the right, we hear about violent insurgents. From the left, we hear about paramilitaries. That's the predictable debate that seems frozen in time. It's trapped in the 80s. You're either soft on communism or you're soft on death squads. And it has more to do with the politics of Washington than beating back the perils that so many people face in the Americas. The person living in fear of violence doesn't care if they're threatened by a right-wing paramilitary or a left-wing terrorist. They don't care if they're being threatened by a drug cartel or a corrupt police force. They just care that they're being threatened and that their families can't live and work in peace. And that is why there will never be true security unless we focus our efforts on targeting every source of fear in the Americas. And that's what I'll do as President of the United States. Let me give you an example. For the people of Colombia, who've suffered at the hands of killers of every sort, that means battling all sources of violence. When I am president, we will continue the Andean counter-drug program and update it to meet evolving challenges. We will fully support Colombia's fight against the FARC. We'll work with the government. We'll work with the government to end the reign of terror from right-wing paramilitaries. We will support Colombia's right to strike terrorists who seek safe haven across its borders. And we will shine a light on any support for the FARC that comes from neighboring governments. This behavior must be exposed to international condemnation, regional isolation, and if need be, strong sanctions. It must not stand, and it will not when I'm President of the United States of America. But we must also make clear our support for labor rights and human rights, and that means meaningful support for Colombia's democratic institutions. We've neglected this support, especially for the rule of law, for far too long. In every country in our hemisphere, including our own, governments must develop the tools to protect their people. Because if we've learned anything in our history in the Americas, it's that true security cannot come from force alone. Not as long as there are towns in Mexico where drug kingpins are more powerful than judges. Not as long as there are children who grow up afraid of the police. Not as long as drugs and gangs move north across our border while guns and cash move south in return. This nexus is a danger to every country in the region, including our own. Thousands of Central American gang members have been arrested across the United States, including here in South Florida. There are national emergencies facing Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Mexican drug cartels are terrorizing cities and towns. President Calderon was right to say that enough is enough. We must support Mexico's efforts to crack down, but what we must stand for is more than force. We must support the rule of law from the bottom up. And that means more investment in prevention and prosecutors, in community policing, and an independent judiciary. I agree with my friend, Senator Dick Lugar. The Merida Initiative does not invest enough in Central America, where much of the trafficking and gang activity begins. and we must press further south as well. It's time to work together to find the best practices that work across the hemisphere and to tailor approaches to fit each country. And that's why I will direct my Attorney General and Secretary of Homeland Security to sit down with all their counterparts in the Americas during my first year in office. We'll strive for a unity of effort. We'll provide the resources and ask every country to do the same. And we'll tie our support to clear benchmarks for drug seizures, corruption prosecutions, and crime reduction, and kingpins who've been busted. We have to do our part, and that's why a core part of this effort will be a northbound-southbound strategy. We need tougher border security and a renewed focus on busting up gangs and traffickers crossing our borders. But we must address the material heading south as well. As president, I'll make it clear that we're coming after the guns, we're coming after the money laundering, and we're coming after the vehicles that enable this crime. And we'll crack down on the demand for drugs in our own communities and restore funding for the drug task forces and the cops programs, because we have to win these fights on our streets if we're going to make the region more secure. We have to make sure that we're protecting our children right here in the United States, as well as children overseas. That will be a priority when I'm president of the United States of America. The third part of my agenda is advancing freedom from want, because there is much that we can do to advance opportunity for the people of the Americas. That begins with understanding what's changed in Latin America and what hasn't. Enormous wealth has been created. Financial markets are far stronger than a decade ago. Brazil's economy has grown by leaps and bounds, and perhaps the second richest person in the world is a Mexican. Yet while there has been great economic progress, there is still backbreaking inequality. Despite a growing middle class, 100 million people live on less than $2 a day. 40% of Latin Americans live in poverty. This feeds everything from drugs to migration to support for leaders that appeal to the poor without delivering other promises. That is why the United States must stand for the growth in the Americas from the bottom up. That begins at home with comprehensive immigration reform. That means securing our border and passing tough employer enforcement laws, but it also means bringing 12 million unauthorized immigrants out of the shadows. And it means